This is Smart SketchUp. I am Shane Scranton. Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about creating a flexible model. And what I mean by that is creating groups, creating components, and putting them into layers. This is honestly probably the most important screencast I'll ever make, so I hope that this can get some views and people can watch it, because at the end of the day it'll create better modelers, and it'll create models that we can all use and share. So I'm sure we're familiar with this all too common issue. When you open up SketchUp and you start modeling, maybe you're tired, kind of like I am, and you're just going and going and going, and then you want to move something, and suddenly you realize that it's 6 faces. But that's okay. You grab this and you move it over maybe to the center line over here, and you like that, but then maybe you want to move this piece over a little bit, and then you want to grab these 4 faces again. And suddenly you realize that it's going to be hard to do it. And then let's say you want to move it. And suddenly you have a pretty horrible model that's not really easily editable. And no matter how good of a modeler you are, you're going to end up with something like this if you don't start organizing your model right off the bat. And so what's happened to my workflow is now whenever I draw a new shape, I immediately do that, which is double click and then Control G, and that groups it immediately. And you can also, if you're not used to key commands, you can double click on it, right click, and hit make group. But honestly, get used to hitting Control G all the time, because literally any new thing I draw, I am hitting Control G. And there's, if you haven't seen this before, there are major benefits to doing this. So first of all, now you have a self-contained model inside of your model. So anything you do to this remains inside of itself in a sense. So if I create another box and group it, now with that same example, these still remain separate, so I can move them independently of each other. And you can take it one step further and make groups within groups, and really as many groups down as you'd like, where I can make this group, and now you can see we have 2 bounding boxes, which means that we have, this is in essence 2 groups, one inside of the other. So now we can move this entire thing, or we can go in and move this thing. And you'll see that I actually was lazy and didn't make this a group, but I'd like to do that as well. So I'll just highlight it and hit group, and now I have 2 separate groups. Right, so the concept is pretty basic, but it's amazing how once you start using it, you can really make robust models that are incredibly editable. This is a model that I made for an architect here in Vermont, and you'll see that every single thing in here is actually its own entity. So if I wanted to move, say, the top floor without siding, I think this is what layer it is. Yeah. So there's the top floor pretty much extruded from floor plans. And if I wanted to move this window, there I am moving this window. And this is because I rely heavily, heavily, heavily on groups. Now, you've also probably heard about components. Components are groups that are linked to one another. So a component is just as simple. You draw it, you double click on it, instead of hitting Control G, you hit G. And now you're going to get this pop-up that popped up in my other screen, where it's going to ask you to name your component. I'm going to call it demo. I recommend naming it something smart. And these are advanced options that we'll touch on later. So you can create this, and now it acts just the same as a group, except you get these 3 axes down here that show where the vertex of this component is. And what happens with components is they're all linked together. So if I duplicate it a couple times by hitting move and then hitting control, anything I do to one happens to all of them. And now this is really nice. You can suddenly create repetitive, say, structural posts, or if you wanted to create a light or a chair where you're going to be repeating them, you can create components that will then update if you change an aspect about them. Another more advanced thing about components is they'll react once you're inside of them, so anything I do inside of the component will reflect across all components. But anything I do outside the component, say scale it, will only affect that one component. So you can be pretty tricky with this, but this will then, anything I do here will affect the other components proportionately. So you see this is more of a square, these are thinner, because I had stretched this out. And finally, this is me coming in from the future, we need to talk about layers. And I'm saving layers till last because when I'm modeling, it's also what I save until last. You'll notice that in this very advanced model I've created, let's pretend this is a house that we've spent 40 hours on, and this is its floor plan or something. And we have everything grouped out nicely in components, everything the way we want it to, and yet I still have everything. If we go to Entity Info, I still have everything on layer 0, which is absolutely my preference. This is when I would start adding things into their own layers. And the reason I do it so late in the game is, let's create a new example where I'm going to group this, and I'm going to say that this is going to be test 1. So right now if we turn off that layer, test 1 goes down. But let's say I'm still modeling, and I sort of lose track of time, and I keep going, and I'm like, oh, that'd be great. That's going to be in test 2. And now I want to show only test 2 objects. If I turn off test 1, my test 2 is still lost in there. And it's a lot easier to assign layers once you're done modeling, so something like that won't happen. So anyway, let's assume that I've totally finished this model. This is when I would go in and, I don't know, let's rename this to roof, and then assign this roof, right? And I also usually have a DWG section where I import all my AutoCAD into, and we'd assign this to DWG. So that's very important to remember. Group it, component it, and then at the end of the whole process, pretty much as late as you can possibly wait, then apply layers. That'll save you many headaches.